"Hey, you disgrace! You're no longer wanted here." Those cruel words cut through the air like knives, shattering her dignity in front of the whole world. But what they didn't know was that the woman they tried to humiliate was about to flip the script in the most shocking way ever. Stay right here, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and comment where you're watching from, because this story will ignite you. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Marriott glowed with gold chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the murmurs of wealth echoing off every corner. Men in tailored suits clinked glasses, women in diamond-studded gowns adjusted their pearls, and photographers snapped flashes across the room. Into that glittering crowd walked Lena Carter, a woman whose quiet grace belied the storm inside her. Her skin was the deep bronze of ancestry, her frame wrapped in a gown she had chosen with care, not to outshine but to simply belong. Yet belonging was always the one thing she could never quite achieve in Richard's world. Even before she crossed the threshold, eyes followed her, conversations broke, and reformed into whispers. A woman near the champagne bar tilted her head toward Lena and smirked, her voice dripping with mockery as she said, "She carries herself well for someone who married up." The comment traveled like perfume in the air, faint but lingering. A waiter brushing past her muttered an apology too quickly, spilling a drop of wine near her shoes, not daring to make real eye contact. Microaggressions weren't new to Lena, but tonight, beneath the crystal glow, each one felt sharpened, as though the room itself was conspiring to remind her she did not belong. Richard stood across the hall, tall and polished, a perfect mask of charm stretched across his face. His hand rested on the small of a woman's back, blonde hair cascading like silk, lips painted scarlet, her body wrapped in a glittering dress that left little to imagination. The woman laughed loudly at his words, a sound that pierced through the hum of chatter. When Richard spotted Lena, his smile did not falter, but his eyes carried the cold satisfaction of a man eager to wound. He motioned her over, with a wave too casual for a husband, too cruel for a partner. Lena's heels clicked against the marble as she approached. Every step felt heavier, her throat tightening, her pulse echoing against her ears. Richard's new mistress, bold and unashamed, leaned closer to him as if staking a claim. The cruelty wasn't subtle. It was a performance, staged for the entire room. Guests leaned in to watch, their polished faces lit with intrigue, like spectators at an unfolding tragedy. When she reached him, Richard kissed the blonde on the cheek, deliberately slow, his eyes never leaving Lena's. "Lena," he said smoothly, "this is Madison. Isn't she stunning?" His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet, cutting without raising volume. Madison extended a manicured hand, her smile dripping with condescension. "I've heard so much about you," she said, her tone implying every word was an insult. Lena's hand trembled slightly, but she clasped it, her dignity refusing to collapse before them. Inside, however, humiliation burned her chest raw. The woman's skin was soft, her touch firm, but it was the smirk that lingered, a silent declaration of victory. Lena let go quickly, forcing her lips into a controlled smile, while her heart screamed in silence. Around them, the whispers grew louder. A couple nearby exchanged knowing glances. "I knew it wouldn't last," one man whispered. "He finally found someone who fits his world." The words sliced deep. To them, Lena had always been the outsider, the dark mark in Richard's perfect white life. She remembered the early years, how people congratulated Richard with backhanded compliments, saying things like, "You're so open-minded," or "She's different, not like the others." At first, Lena had brushed them aside, but tonight, those memories resurfaced like ghosts, binding her tighter to the chains of ridicule. Richard leaned closer to Madison, his hand resting possessively at her waist, his eyes scanning the crowd to ensure every pair of eyes caught the display. Lena stood frozen, her pride unraveling in threads. It wasn't just infidelity, it was theater. Her humiliation was the main act, and every guest was an eager spectator. Still, she lifted her chin, her eyes refusing to drop, though her body trembled beneath the weight of scorn. The music swelled, a jazz band playing cheerfully in cruel contrast to her breaking heart. She excused herself quietly, walking toward the far end of the room, away from Richard's calculated cruelty. Each step away felt like exile, the marble floor stretching endlessly beneath her heels. She slipped onto a balcony overlooking the city skyline, the cool night air rushing against her heated face. Lights twinkled across Atlanta, distant and indifferent to her pain. She gripped the railing tightly, fighting back tears, every muscle in her body taut with the effort of holding herself together. Inside, laughter erupted, a chorus of delight that seemed to mock her solitude. Lena's reflection in the glass door caught her eye. For years, she had been Richard's partner, his wife, his equal in commitment, though never in the eyes of his world. Tonight, that illusion shattered. She saw herself not as a wife in a shimmering gown, but as an unwelcome guest in a life she had given everything to build. The wound wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. Behind her, the door slid open. She heard the echo of Richard's laugh, followed by Madison's high-pitched giggle, searing into her bones. Lena did not turn. She stood still, breathing slowly, her tears refusing to fall. Somewhere deep inside her, a seed of anger sprouted, fragile but alive. She didn't know then that this night, designed to strip her of dignity, would become the first chapter of her reclamation. The ballroom roared on, but on that balcony, beneath the cold starlight, Lena's silence spoke louder than Richard's cruelty, and though she felt broken, humiliated, and discarded, something inside whispered that this would not be the end. The divorce proceedings began with a sterile chill that clung to every corner of the courthouse. The building, with its towering pillars and marble floors, carried an air of power that never quite belonged to her. Lena Carter sat stiffly in the oak-paneled courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the strain. Across the aisle, Richard lounged in his seat, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed the system would always bend to his favor. His expensive navy suit, tailored to perfection, shimmered faintly under the harsh courtroom lights, as though even fabric bowed to his wealth. The lawyers lined the tables like soldiers in battle. Richard's attorney, a sharp-jawed man with silver hair and piercing eyes, rifled through stacks of documents with calculated precision. Lena's lawyer, though competent, looked weary, burdened by the uphill fight he knew awaited. From the very start, it was clear that Lena was the one on trial, not Richard. Whispers from the gallery leaked into her ears, each one a reminder that she was both a black woman and a soon-to-be ex-wife standing against white wealth and influence. Richard did not simply seek freedom. He sought spectacle. Each word he uttered was coated with venom, meant to stain her. "She never truly fit in," he said at one point, his voice pitched just loud enough for the entire room to hear. "She's not polished enough for this world. I carried her." The words cracked against Lena's skin like whips, but she refused to flinch. Inside, humiliation churned with rage, threatening to consume her. When Madison entered, his mistress, his chosen weapon of cruelty, the energy shifted. She sauntered into the room in a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She sat directly behind Richard, crossing her legs deliberately, as if to remind Lena of her displacement. Whispers multiplied, and Lena felt the sting of eyes tearing into her. She could almost hear the unspoken chorus. "This is the upgrade. This is the replacement." The judge's voice echoed, firm and detached, but Lena barely heard the legal jargon. She caught fragments: division of assets, alimony, forfeiture of marital property. Each phrase was another hammer driving nails into the coffin of her dignity. Richard smirked each time his lawyer presented evidence of his, quote, greater financial contribution, conveniently erasing Lena's years of sacrifices, her sleepless nights managing his home, her endless support that allowed him to rise in the first place. By midday, Lena's lawyer whispered that fighting for more would be futile. "He's covered every base," he murmured, eyes downcast. "The prenup, the accounts, the property transfers. He's left crumbs, and the court will likely side with him. Crumbs. That word lodged in her chest, burning hotter than the pain of betrayal. Richard leaned over at one point, his voice a poisonous whisper that only she could hear. "Don't take it too hard, Lena. You'll find your place. Maybe in some small office job. Madison and I, though, we belong to this world." His lips curled into a cruel smile, and Lena felt the air squeeze from her lungs. The papers arrived, thick stacks awaiting her signature. The pen felt heavier than any weight she had ever carried. Each signature stripped away another piece of her identity, her home, her financial security, the empire she had quietly helped nurture but was never credited for. Madison's perfume wafted faintly in the background, sweet and mocking, as though the mistress herself were savoring Lena's fall. When the final document slid before her, Lena hesitated. Her hand trembled, and for a moment the courtroom's buzz quieted. Richard arched an eyebrow, smirking, his gaze daring her to resist. Madison leaned forward ever so slightly, her lips curving into a victorious grin. The pressure of their combined cruelty pressed against Lena like a vice. With a sharp inhale, she signed. Gasps fluttered through the gallery, not because of the signature itself, but because of what followed. Richard, with the arrogance of a man who thought he had won everything, pulled Madison close and kissed her boldly in front of the entire court. It was not affection. It was a declaration of dominance, a humiliating endnote to a public execution of Lena's dignity. The judge rapped his gavel, calling for order, but the damage had already been carved into Lena's soul. She left the courthouse in silence, her heels clicking against the stone steps as flashes from journalists, cameras erupted like lightning around her. Reporters shouted questions, their voices slicing through the chaos. "Lena, how do you feel about losing everything? Do you regret the marriage? What's next for you now that Richard has moved on?" She kept her eyes forward, her body rigid, her pride struggling to keep her from collapsing under the weight of shame. Back in her car, the quiet hit her harder than the noise. She rested her head against the steering wheel, her body trembling, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs. Images replayed relentlessly. Richard's smirk, Madison's grin, the smug whispers of strangers who had decided her worth long before she stepped into that courtroom. The divorce had not just ended her marriage. It had stripped her identity, her place in a world she had given herself to. Yet beneath the wreckage, a fire stirred. She could not name it yet. Was it rage? Was it the whisper of resilience? Or simply the refusal to let humiliation define her? Whatever it was, it simmered, faint but alive. Though she drove away from the courthouse that day with nothing but the echo of loss, somewhere deep inside, Lena Carter's breaking point was drawing near. And when it came, it would not be silent. Lena Carter returned to the small neighborhood where her story had begun. A place of cracked sidewalks, narrow streets, and houses whose paint had long surrendered to time. It was far removed from the glittering galas and glass towers where Richard still paraded with Madison on his arm. Here, the world seemed quieter, but no less cruel. Every faded brick, every peeling fence carried memories of struggle. And though she had driven away from the courthouse with nothing but emptiness clinging to her, the moment she stepped onto her mother's old porch, the weight of her past and present collapsed on her shoulders. Inside the dimly lit living room, Lena sat in silence. The furniture was worn, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and wood polish. Family photographs lined the walls, faces of ancestors who had survived oppression etched in black and white. Her father's smile stared back at her from a picture above the mantel, a man of quiet strength whose presence had once made her feel unshakable. Now, staring into his frozen eyes, she felt as if she had failed not just herself but him too. The whispers of Atlanta society still gnawed at her mind. She was never enough. She didn't belong. She's been replaced, each one replayed like a haunting refrain, burning away at her resolve. For nights, Lena barely ate. Sleep eluded her, and when it came, it brought nightmares of Madison laughing, Richard kissing her in public, cameras flashing, and crowds applauding her humiliation. She would wake drenched in sweat, her chest heaving, her heart screaming for relief. Yet, in her darkest hour, the neighborhood reminded her of resilience. Old neighbors stopped by with warm meals wrapped in foil. Children waved when she stepped outside, their innocence cutting through her despair. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jackson from across the street, grasped her hands one afternoon and whispered, "Don't let them break you, baby. You come from stronger roots than he'll ever know." Lena smiled weakly, but her soul still trembled, a storm without direction. Then, one ordinary morning, a knock shattered the monotony of her grief. Standing at the door was a man in a gray suit, his briefcase polished, his expression grave but respectful. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked softly. She nodded, wary. He introduced himself as Robert Hayes, an attorney representing her late father's estate. In his hands, he held a thick envelope, sealed with a crimson stamp. "This was meant for you," he said. "Your father instructed me to deliver it only at this time." Her heart stuttered as she took the envelope. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should allow, as if secrets and destiny pressed against its seal. Hands trembling, she sat at the kitchen table and broke it open. Inside was a stack of documents, yellowed slightly with age, but meticulously preserved. The first page bore her father's familiar handwriting, strong and deliberate. "Lena, if you are reading this, it means life has tested you in ways I feared it would. But I did not leave you unarmed. There are truths you do not know, truths that tie your future to the empire Richard claims as his." Her pulse quickened, her breath caught in her throat. She read further, her father explaining how years ago, he and Richard's late business partner had built the foundation of the company that Richard now controlled. But when her father withdrew due to racial discrimination and threats from investors who refused to accept a black man as an equal partner, his stake was buried beneath legal loopholes and silences. What Richard never knew was that her father kept ironclad agreements, documents that ensured his family's rights would one day resurface. And those rights, signed and sealed, now belonged to Lena. The room spun around her as she processed the words. She could scarcely believe it. After all the humiliation, all the stripping away of dignity, here was proof that Richard's empire was not fully his. The man who mocked her, who paraded another woman before her, who left her for scraps, his empire was built partly on her father's sweat, and by law, that legacy was hers to reclaim. Energy coursed through her veins, the first true surge of power she had felt in months. She clutched the documents to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of release, of rage finding purpose. For the first time since Richard flaunted his mistress, Lena felt something other than despair. She felt destiny stirring. She rose from the table, her reflection in the kitchen window catching her eye. Gone was the broken woman who walked out of the courthouse in shame. In her place stood a woman blood-bound to resilience, a daughter carrying her father's unfulfilled promise. The fire in her chest burned hotter, brighter, filling every hollow place Richard had carved into her. That night, Lena spread the documents across her bed, poring over each line, each signature, each clause that confirmed her inheritance of power. The legal terms were complex, but their meaning was simple. She was not powerless. In fact, she might hold the key to everything Richard believed, untouchable. For days, she studied, consulted discreetly with Robert Hayes, and began forming a plan. Richard thought he had buried her beneath humiliation and ruin. He had no idea that beneath the ashes, she had found a weapon sharper than revenge, justice wrapped in her father's handwriting. As she drifted into sleep with the papers beside her, Lena whispered to herself, "This is not the end." The energy in her voice trembled like a storm waiting to break, the kind that could level empires. In the silence of that small neighborhood home, Lena Carter's rebirth began, not with riches or applause, but with the revelation that she carried the power to reclaim everything stolen from her. And when she struck, the world that once mocked her would be forced to watch. The ballroom gleamed once more, but this time the air felt different to Lena. Months had passed since the divorce hearing that had stripped her bare. Months since she stood trembling on that balcony, while Richard flaunted his mistress for the world to see. Tonight, Richard was hosting another extravagant gala, and the city's elite flocked in like moths to golden light. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter rippled through silk and velvet, and cameras flashed as reporters swirled around the spectacle of Richard and Madison, now parading as husband and wife. Lena walked into that same glittering space, no longer carrying the weight of humiliation, but cloaked in a presence that silenced whispers as she passed. Her gown was midnight silk, flowing like power incarnate, her hair a crown of unapologetic black beauty. Eyes followed her, but not with pity this time. Something about her stride, her aura, carried an authority that unsettled the room. Still, whispers floated. Isn't that Richard's ex? Why is she here? Bold, considering what happened. Each word reached her ears, but instead of wounding, they fueled the fire burning inside. Across the hall, Richard spotted her. His smile twisted into a smirk, the same arrogant curve of lips that once mocked her in court. Madison clung to his arm, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier's glow as if to blind anyone who dared look elsewhere. Together, they radiated the smugness of victory. Richard raised his glass toward Lena in a mocking toast, his eyes daring her to crumble again. But tonight, Lena had come armed. The music swelled, the band's brass echoing against marble, when she stepped forward. The crowd instinctively parted, eyes widening at the woman they once whispered about in pity. Lena's heels struck the floor with the weight of thunder, her every step pulsing with resolve. She stopped in the center of the ballroom, directly beneath the chandelier's radiant glow, her presence impossible to ignore. "Richard," she called, her voice carrying through the hall like steel wrapped in velvet. Conversations hushed, heads turned, and silence fell heavy across the room. Richard laughed, the sound dripping with arrogance. "Lena," he replied, dragging out her name as if savoring the chance to humiliate her again. He drew Madison closer, his hand squeezing her waist. "You're brave to come here. Didn't you have enough of this world?" The crowd chuckled nervously, sensing drama but uncertain of the ending. Lena did not flinch. She reached into her clutch and withdrew a neat stack of documents, crisp and undeniable. With one sharp motion, she dropped them onto the nearest table, the papers scattering across champagne glasses and polished silverware. "I came to reclaim what belongs to me," she said, her voice firm, resonant, carrying an edge that pierced the hush like lightning across a night sky. A ripple moved through the guests as curious hands reached for the documents. Eyes scanned the signatures, the seals, the clauses that spelled out a truth Richard had hidden, or perhaps never even known. Murmurs rose like a storm. Her father's stake? Half the empire? She owns this? Richard's face drained of color, his smirk collapsing under the weight of shock. He lunged toward the papers, snatching them up, flipping page after page, his fingers trembling. This is ridiculous," he spat, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. Madison clutched his arm, her glossy smile faltering, her diamond necklace suddenly feeling like a chain. Lena stepped closer, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "For years you flaunted me as your accessory, your token, and when you were finished, you discarded me. You thought I had nothing left. But this empire you wave around like your birthright, its roots run through my father's hands, his vision, his sacrifice. And now, by law and by legacy, it is mine." Gasps broke across the ballroom. Phones were raised, flashes exploding like fireworks as the crowd documented the collapse of Richard's perfect facade. The same society that once mocked Lena now turned their gaze on Richard with ravenous hunger. The humiliation he had orchestrated for her was unraveling before his very eyes, magnified tenfold. Richard's voice cracked, desperation seeping through. "You don't understand, Lena. You can't. This company is mine. It's always been mine." His words tumbled out frantic, brittle. "No." Lena cut him off sharply, her words like fire igniting dry timber. "It was built on stolen ground, and tonight the truth burns through your lies." The crowd erupted into whispers, their voices layering into a chorus of judgment. Madison, sensing the shift, pulled away from Richard, her face flushed with fury. "You told me she was nothing," she hissed, her voice loud enough for half the hall to hear. The humiliation Richard once delighted in had circled back, striking him under the spotlight he had crafted for himself. Lena stood tall, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked on Richard with unyielding power. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who once controlled her fate, but as a hollow figure, unraveling under the truth. Every ounce of dignity he had stolen, every humiliation he had cast, came crashing back upon him, and she did not flinch as the weight buried him. The documents lay scattered across the table like judgment itself, irrefutable, undeniable. Guests snapped photos. Others whispered to reporters already drafting headlines. Ex-wife exposes Richard Carter. Empire belongs to her. Cameras flashed, capturing not just Richard's collapse but Lena's rise. She took a step back, lifting her chin. "You thought you ended me," she said, her voice ringing clear, "but you only freed me to claim what was always mine." The room, silent for a beat, erupted into applause. Some clapped in awe, others in sheer thrill of scandal, but the sound surged like a wave, lifting Lena higher than she had ever stood. Richard's face twisted in rage and disbelief. Madison stormed toward the exit, and Lena, under the golden light of the chandelier, stood as the embodiment of justice, her fire burning too bright to ever be dimmed again. That night, the world witnessed not her downfall, but his reckoning. The morning after the gala, every major newspaper headline carried Lena Carter's name. Her face, once cast in shadows of humiliation, now blazed across front pages. Black ex-wife reclaims billionaire empire. Richard Carter exposed. Justice served in stunning turn. Social media exploded, clips of the confrontation going viral. Strangers who once mocked her now called her hero. Richard, once the untouchable golden boy of Atlanta's elite, was now the face of disgrace. But Lena's fight wasn't finished. It was just beginning. She entered the towering glass headquarters of Carter Industries, with Robert Hayes by her side, the same documents clutched in his leather briefcase. The building, once a symbol of everything she had been excluded from, seemed to vibrate with energy as employees gathered, whispering, staring. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted her name, and security scrambled, unsure of whether to stop her or step aside. She moved past them all, her stride unshaken, fire radiating from her every step. Upstairs, in the boardroom lined with mahogany walls and gleaming with polished steel, Richard was waiting. He looked less like the titan of industry and more like a cornered animal. His tie was loose, his eyes bloodshot, and sweat glistened on his forehead. Madison was nowhere to be seen. She had abandoned him the moment the cameras turned against him. "You think this changes anything?" Richard spat the words the second she entered. His voice cracked, betraying desperation. "You don't belong in this room, Lena. You never have." Lena paused at the head of the long table, her gaze sweeping across the board members who had gathered, their faces unreadable, their loyalties shifting with the tide of power. She placed the documents on the table with deliberate calm, her eyes never leaving Richard's. "I don't just belong here," she said, her voice like a flame scorching through silence. "I own this room." Gasps rippled through the boardroom as Robert opened the briefcase and spread the legal documents for all to see. Signatures gleamed in ink, seals confirmed authenticity, and clauses left no room for argument. Board members leaned forward, murmuring, eyes widening as they pieced together the truth. Richard lunged for the papers, his hand trembling, but Lena stopped him with nothing more than her stare. "You paraded me like I was a trophy, discarded me like trash, and laughed while this world mocked me," she said, her words steady, searing through him like fire. "But this empire you claimed as yours, it was built on the legacy of my father, his blood, his vision, his sacrifice, and now, by law and destiny, it is mine." The chairman of the board cleared his throat, his voice heavy with authority. "Mr. Carter, the documents are binding. The shares, the rights, they transfer to Mrs. Carter, effective immediately." The words struck the room like thunder. Richard's face twisted, his mouth opening in protest, but nothing came out. He staggered back into his chair, his body deflating as the realization crashed down. The empire he once wielded like a weapon was slipping through his fingers, and the woman he had tried to destroy now stood as its rightful heir. Lena stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "You tried to erase me. Tonight I erase your arrogance. Every room you enter will remember this moment. Not the gala, not the mistress, but the day your empire crumbled at the feet of the woman you humiliated." With that, she signed the final transfer documents. The pen glided across the page, each stroke a reclamation of dignity, each curve of ink burning away the years of ridicule. When she set the pen down, the boardroom erupted in applause. Not polite, hesitant applause, but thunderous clapping from men and women who had witnessed history. Cameras captured the moment, flashes illuminating Lena's face as she rose taller than ever. Richard buried his head in his hands, his empire slipping into the hands of the woman he had mocked as unworthy. The board members turned their eyes from him, their loyalty shifting like shadows in the sun. Madison's absence screamed louder than any insult. She had vanished, leaving him to face disgrace alone. Lena lifted her chin, fire blazing in her eyes. She did not gloat. She did not laugh. Her victory was not petty. It was justice. It was the reckoning of every insult, every whispered humiliation, every systemic wall built to cage her. She stood not just as Richard's ex-wife, but as a black woman who had carried her pain, endured her shame, and transformed it into unshakable power. When she left the boardroom, the lobby erupted in cheers. Employees clapped, some with tears in their eyes, as Lena walked past them. Reporters shouted her name, thrusting microphones forward, begging for a statement. She paused at the top of the marble staircase, the light from the glass ceiling pouring down on her like a spotlight. Cameras clicked wildly. "My name is Lena Carter," she said, her voice steady, soaring above the chaos. "I was humiliated, ridiculed, and discarded. But today, I stand as proof that you cannot bury the truth, and you cannot silence justice. This empire is mine, not because I married into it, but because it was always written in my bloodline, and I will run it with the dignity, strength, and vision that my father gave me. This is not Richard's legacy. It is ours, and it begins now." The crowd erupted, voices chanting her name, their applause shaking the very walls. Phones streamed her words to millions watching online, the story spreading faster than fire. As she descended the staircase, the fire within her burned brighter than the chandelier's glow. Richard sat alone in the boardroom above, shattered, abandoned, a hollow man stripped of his empire. Madison's footsteps had long vanished, her silence louder than betrayal. But Lena Carter walked out into the sunlight, her crown invisible but undeniable, her empire reclaimed, her dignity unbreakable. What began as a night of humiliation had become a story of triumph, one that would be told for generations. The black woman who turned her pain into fire and stood victorious against a world that tried to erase her. And there you have it. She walked out not as a victim, but as the queen of an empire they never thought she could own. From humiliation to triumph, she proved the world wrong. But tell me, what would you have done if you were in her shoes? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And don't leave without smashing that like button, subscribing for more powerful stories, and turning on your notifications. Because the next story will shake you even harder than this one.